so happy we alive.
I was speaking about with the immorality. Marijuana is not immoral. That's a social consideration, of course, that's prejudice handed down from our great government. And science leads society in the Western world, and of course, it's the science behind medical marijuana which has created the medical marijuana movement. Usually opponents of medical marijuana and the legalization love to throw stones and say that there's a bunch of hippies out there trying to turn you on to medical marijuana. The fact is that the truth is very far from that. The fact is that doctors write recommendations for marijuana patients in many states in this country. They put their reputations and their licenses on the line by doing so. And they do so not politically, of course, but medically. They do it because marijuana is good medicine, and there is no prejudicial bigotry that can overcome these facts. I was fortunate to speak before the Washington State Senate last February, and it was coincidentally on Martin Luther King Day. And I felt that some of the senators there were perhaps a little shocked that I invoked, the memory of Martin Luther King at that time. But the fact is, I represent a small share of a much broader, larger minority, of course, as Alan was pointing out. People who use marijuana for any reason, of course, even though there are millions of us, it's a small minority compared to what's on CNN, I guess, and that influences our politics. So we need to uphold the truth, and we need to play our cards, play the truth. The truth is we are one of the worst oppressed minorities I can imagine. People who use marijuana are criminals. We are subject to the worst sort of treatment in society. Let me go on. It is an honor to be here with you today, speaking at this very esteemed panel. Thank you, Normal, for providing this opportunity to discuss the state of marijuana in Washington. I'm here to talk about medical marijuana, but the fact is, once upon a time, I was a pothead too. In fact, I smoked more marijuana than anyone else I knew when I was younger. There were many years I smoked marijuana at least once a day, every day. Then one dark night a car slammed into my motorcycle at 60 miles per hour, and my whole life changed. I was no longer young and healthy. I was old and broken, and I was no longer a recreational drug user. Marijuana patients are often reluctant to admit they use marijuana before they were sick because opponents so often label us as legalizers. And to me, it seems quite reasonable that people with prior experience with marijuana would be more likely to use it as medicine if they fell ill and needed it. Regardless, people must realize there is a huge difference between severe medical cases and typical recreational use. Washington state law is different than here in California. Patients on the list there are all terminal or intractable by definition. Those who use medical marijuana often develop a huge tolerance, and they require far greater amounts than most people imagine. I myself use almost 10 times the amount I smoked when I was a pothead 20 years ago. And it's much stronger, it's true.
Thank you.
About 10 years ago, a small army of police officers broke down my door and ripped my life apart. I spent 2 years fighting the right to possess marijuana as a medical necessity. During that time, California passed Proposition 215. And soon after that, my doctor filed the Medical Use of Marijuana Act in Washington. And when our initiative passed by almost a 2-to-1 margin, I thought it would prevent other people from suffering the same misery I had gone through in my legal battle. I was a little naive. About a year after the initiative passed, I got a call from my attorney. He was calling to ask me for a favor for a change. A man named Bangs was facing a stiff sentence because the sheriff had found a few scruffy marijuana plants in his yard. Mr. Bangs was a patient, but he was found guilty on the technicality. It was my job to help reduce his sentence by explaining how marijuana patients tend to use more medicine than most recreational users. The judge was very intrigued by my testimony. Clearly, he had no other reliable source of information on the subject. And he was curious. Mr. Bangs received a light sentence. But then there was another case, and another, and other attorneys began calling. And I was compelled to continue defending the right to possess marijuana for far too long. I have met with many police officers and prosecutors. I have provided a factual analysis in written testimony, and in criminal court I have testified before the state senate and the House in Washington. I have testified before the Washington State Bar Association. After some legal wrangling and some misunderstandings have been achieved in some cases, but these cases still keep coming. Even this last month, there's a new case that I'm involved in. I've spent hours and hours poring over police reports and sifting the remains of marijuana patients' gardens on the floor of a police evidence room in the basement of the courthouse. I've been deposed in more than a dozen cases, and I've been consulted on many more. It has been rewarding when my testimony has helped uphold patient rights. But the fact is, I'm not an attorney, and this is not the type of work I enjoy. I am personally very sick, by the way, and I am actually very weary of these intense arguments over relatively small medical gardens. Washington patients are required to provide valid documentation on demand, but all too often the patient may be accused of forgery. And then he's forced to spend hours in police custody. Medical marijuana gardens are often destroyed regardless of medical documentation. In some counties, police officers actually tell people that there is no medical marijuana law, that it has been revoked by the legislature, which is a complete fabrication. Great legislative support was rallied again this year by our hero, Senator Gene Cole-Wells, but our issue is marginalized, way off the page, once again this year. There has been some great progress in Washington, yes, but I am sad to say that in some cases and in some ways, not much has changed since my first arrest back in 1996. And there are many reasons for this. Locally, and of course, it's the law enforcement is subject to the individuals in charge. But remember, of course, that we're all here because all of our state laws and all of our community laws are ultimately driven by the DEA's heavy hand. I personally have had my house searched. I've had police officers at the door of my office. I was under surveillance for many months. Just this last year, I had to move my office because I couldn't stand looking at the police every day. And it's a big waste of money for everybody concerned. Many of the legal cases I referred to are posted on my website, cannabismd.org. cannabismd.org. I put a lot into that. There's a huge amount of information. I have written a book, The New Prescription, Marijuana as Medicine, that includes references to the majority of important medical marijuana science that was published previous to the year 2000. There's been an awful lot since